Welcome back, deep divers. Here on Occult Archives, we don't shy away from the books that made history tremble a little.
That's right. The ones that were whispered about, tucked away in dark corners, maybe even feared.
Precisely. Because, let's face it, those are often the books with the most fascinating stories.
And for episode 269, we're diving into one that really tickles the spine, the Phantom World.
Oh yeah, the Phantom World.
Yep.
Forbidden spirits, witchcraft, vampires, and the secret realm of the undead. Quite a mouthful, isn't it? Written by Augustin Calmet, published back in 1746. Now, before anyone thinks we're endorsing all this, let's be clear.
We're traveling back in time here.
Exactly. We want to understand what people believed, why they believed it, and what it says about their world.
It's a window into a mindset very different from our own.
And let's be honest, who doesn't love a good ghost story, especially when it's steeped in history? So buckle up, deep divers, because we're about to explore angels, demons, witches, and how people viewed the afterlife back then.
All through the lens of Calmet's Phantom World.
Okay, let's start with something celestial angels. Calmet, leaning heavily on both the Old and New Testaments, says good angels and their appearances are a sure thing. Not just a vague idea, but based on solid biblical references.
Like in the book of Acts, when St. Peter is miraculously busted out of prison.
Oh, right. When he shows up at the house, they think it's his angel at the door.
Exactly. That points to this idea of personal guardian angels, even looking like the person they're guarding.
Fascinating. And it wasn't just a one-off. Calmet brings up St. Paul's belief in angels, too. Paul, with his background in the Pharisees, a Jewish sect, big on interpreting the law and very much into angels and spirits.
He talks about angelic beings all the time in his letters.
And of course, there's St. John's Apocalypse, the Book of Revelation. Angels are all over that.
Key players in divine events. Clearly, this angel business was deeply embedded in both Jewish and early Christian thought.
Calmet considered them as real as the nose on your face, capable of showing up in all sorts of ways.
That's what's really intriguing, the variety of their supposed appearances. Calmet lists them all, appearing as humans, blending in.
Right, like everyday folks.
But it gets more interesting. He suggests they could influence thoughts, speak through voices, even work miracles.
Subtle but powerful stuff.
Then there's the cherubim described by Ezekiel. We're not talking cute little winged babies here.
Oh no, these are something else entirely.
Powerful beings, almost surreal, human-like bodies, but with eagle wings, ox feet, and multiple faces. Man, ox, lion, eagle, all at once.
Wow, talk about a divine mashup.
It really shows you how complex the idea of angels was.
And they weren't all sunshine and rainbows either, were they?
Bruh.
It's easy to think of angels as gentle guardians, but Calmet reminds us they could pack a punch.
Absolutely. He talks about them inflicting blindness, like in the stories of Sodom and those guys chasing Elisha.
Forces to be reckoned with, capable of both kindness and serious judgment.
Makes you think twice about messing with them. To drive the point home, Calmet shares a story about an African bishop during a time of persecution. This bishop, very ill, wanted to receive communion, and instead of a comforting presence, he's visited by an angel.
Not the bedside manner you'd expect.
Right. A majestic young man radiating intense light. But instead of comfort, this angel grills the bishop about being afraid to die.
Intense.
It reminds you, even divine encounters could be quite unsettling. So even in matters of faith, don't expect everything to be easy or predictable.
Good point. Now, from the heavenly host, let's descend into, shall we say, a darker realm. The devil and demonic influence. Calmet sources seem to paint quite the picture of Satan.
Oh, absolutely. That image of Satan as a roaring lion from the first epistle of Peter, always on the prowl, it sets the tone.
Makes you want to check under the bed, just in case.
And then you add St. Paul's warnings about the devil's tricks and traps constantly trying to trip us up.
Not just some vague evil, but an active, malicious force.
A real threat, something to be feared and guarded against. And the scariest part, it wasn't always about outright attacks.
Right. More subtle, sneakier.
Exactly. Sulpicius Severus, in his Life of St. Martin, gives some chilling examples of how the demon could transform into an angel of light.
Like a wolf in sheep's clothing, but with a halo.
A young monk, for instance, thought he was talking to angels. He even got a pure white robe, supposedly a divine gift.
Talk about convincing.
But when St. Martin asked to see him, the robe, poof, gone. Demonic illusion exposed.
Always be careful who you trust, even those who seem angelic.
Exactly. And it gets bolder. This demon actually appears to St. Martin himself. not as a monster, but decked out like royalty, claiming to be Christ.
Talk about audacity.
But St. Martin, sharp as a tack, wasn't buying it. He said flat out, Christ would only appear as he suffered, with the wounds of the cross.
Smart move.
And just like that, the demon vanished. Severus also describes instances of Satan and his buddies appearing as pagan gods like Jupiter, Mercury, Venus, Minerva.
So not just imitating angels, but taking on familiar form.
Right, like the old gods didn't disappear, they just got rebranded as demons, trying to lead people astray. Clever, huh?
Adapting to the times. And Calmet mentions those solitary hermits being tempted too, right?
Oh, all the time. Demons disguised as beautiful women, helpful travelers, even pious priests and monks. Always testing, always tempting.
Constantly having to be on guard against spiritual trickery. Makes you wonder about the mental strain of living with those kinds of beliefs.
Always questioning, never quite sure. Now, from these spiritual deceivers, let's shift to something that really stoked fear back then. Witchcraft and sorcery. What did Calmet have to say about that?
Well, one thing that pops up is the belief in sorcerers and witches being whisked off to the Sabbath.
Ah, yes. Those secret nighttime gatherings where they party with the demons and do all sorts of wicked things.
A common fear across Europe, fueling the persecution of anyone suspected of witchcraft, shows the power of collective fear, creating elaborate narratives around these perceived threats.
And Calmet traces it back even further to ancient Babylon and their magic. They consulted demons through various means, like divination with arrows. Ezekiel mentions that.
The Babylonian Magi had quite the reputation for their occult knowledge.
Oh, yeah, they were deep into it. But Calmet makes a distinction. He says the Magi who came to see baby Jesus were different.
Right, following a divine sign, not messing with demons.
Precisely. It's about context, even when talking up the supernatural. You have your good Magi and your demonic ones.
Makes you wonder what Calmet would make of today's magicians and illusionists.
Right. Would he see them as tricksters, entertainers, or something else entirely? Now, he also brings up those epic poems like Homer's Odyssey, where magic is used to summon spirits.
Achilles rising from the underworld, for example.
Exactly. But Calmet labels those as fabulous fictional, essentially. He's making a point that even back then, people recognized the difference between a good story and literal belief.
A bit of healthy skepticism there.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the philosophical debate about whether magicians could actually control souls.
Oh, right. Lactantius, the Christian writer, had a good jab at the philosophers who denied the soul's immortality.
He basically said, let's see how sure you are when a magician yanks a soul back from Hades.
Talk about putting them on the spot. It shows how belief in the supernatural could challenge even rational arguments.
Always a good debate. And St. Augustine, ever the cautious theologian, wouldn't even say for sure if magicians could summon saints.
He was hesitant, recognizing that not all magic was equal. Some claims were more suspect than others. It makes you think, where do you draw the line between genuine spiritual stuff and plain old trickery?
A good question for any age. Now let's move on to something that must have really freaked people out. Possession and obsession by the devil.
Yeah, this is heavy stuff. Calmet presents it as a straight-up fact, backed by the Bible.
Not just folklore, but a biblical truth.
Exactly. He talks about both full-on possession, where a demon controls your mind and body, and obsession, which is more like external torment.
Think of it like demonic harassment, but on a spiritual level.
And of course, even back then, people had their doubts and offered different explanations.
Right, not everyone was on board with the demonic interpretation. Always that push and pull between religious and more naturalistic explanations.
Calmet tackles those objections head-on. He wants to make sure people understand that demons are real and active. But it's important to note that even centuries ago, there were those who questioned and sought alternative explanations for what seemed supernatural.
Skepticism has a long history. One thing that Calmet points out is the ambiguity surrounding certain events, like levitation, for instance.
Oh, right. Someone floating in midair. Was it an angel, a demon messing with them, or maybe even divine love?
He mentions cases of a monk and a nun who reportedly levitated.
Which makes you wonder, how do you even begin to classify something like that?
It really shows how tricky it can be to separate the divine, the demonic, and the natural world. Calmet even talks about those famous cases of the possessed nuns of Loudun and Mademoiselle de Rampheng.
Complicated situations where careful judgment was crucial. It's a reminder that not everything unusual is supernatural.
Exactly. And Calmet acknowledges that. He even says some things that seemed miraculous back then might have perfectly natural explanations.
Like juggling, or a deaf person reading lips.
Things that could easily be mistaken for magic if you didn't understand them.
Shows that even in his exploration of the supernatural, Calmet had a bit of a scientific mind.
Now, let's delve into what might be considered the core of the phantom world, spirits of the dead and apparitions. This is where things get truly spooky, and we start wrestling with those big questions about what happens after we die and if the dead can come back.
The big mysteries. Calmet starts by contrasting the idea of malevolent angels leading us astray with the idea of guardian angels, like those mentioned in the Psalms.
So, good versus bad, even in the angelic realm.
Right. Then he jumps into these interesting figures from the Bible, fauns, satyrs, those hairy men from Isaiah's description of Babylon's destruction. He even points out how they resemble the elves from folklore.
Interesting. So, biblical imagery blending with those traditional folk beliefs.
Exactly. It shows how those ideas were intertwined.
And what about those familiar geniuses, those personal spirits or guiding voices, like Socrates' famous spirit?
Calmet talks about those too. They blur the line between intuition and external influence. Were they spirits or just parts of ourselves?
A question for the ages.
Calmet mentions the rule against hiding treasure in tombs, but then says there were stories of lost riches being found thanks to benevolent spirits of the dead.
So, not all spirits were bad. Some were even helpful.
Right. Different types of spirits, different intentions.
He even brings up the Pied Piper of Hamelin, hinting at possible supernatural explanations for that mass disappearance.
The children vanishing into thin air, it does lend itself to those kinds of interpretations.
Then there's that famous story of the Witch of Endor summoning Samuel's spirit for King Saul.
Calmet delves into St. Augustine's take on that, asking if it was really Samuel or a demonic fake-out. Even back then, there was debate about the authenticity of those apparitions.
And when Calmet talks about apparitions in biblical battles, like in the books of Maccabees, he says those figures were interpreted either as spirits of dead heroes or as angels.
People trying to make sense of the unexplainable, fitting it into their existing beliefs.
Makes you wonder what we'd make of those events today.
Right. What framework would we use? Now, Calmet also points out that Moses specifically forbade consulting the dead.
A big no-no, spiritually speaking.
Exactly. Too much risk of demonic deception. And he references Jesus' words about spirits not having flesh and bones.
Suggesting that true apparitions wouldn't be physical beings.
More like visions or illusions. But then he goes on to describe visions where souls of the departed are clearly seen.
St. Anthony seeing St. Emmon's soul being carried to heaven, St. Benedict witnessing St. Germain and his sister ascending. Not just illusions, but real glimpses into the afterlife.
Right. But those often serve to confirm the holiness of the deceased, reinforcing the idea of heaven and rewards for the righteous.
He includes more personal stories, too, like St. Martin appearing to Sulpicius Severus after his death, a magistrate seeing his mother's radiant head surrounded by light.
Those personal accounts, while not in the Bible, probably held a lot of weight for believers back then, a more relatable kind of proof.
Then there are the weirder stories, like the Canon of Reims, who supposedly spoke during his own funeral.
That raises all sorts of questions about death and consciousness, doesn't it?
It really does. Calmet reminds us that truly blessed souls and angels appearing is rare, though.
He references Abraham's conversation with the rich man in hell, saying that even sending Lazarus back to warn his brothers wouldn't change their minds.
Divine intervention isn't an everyday occurrence.
Exactly. Which leads to the idea of purgatory, that in-between state where souls are purified before heaven.
And the question of whether those souls could appear to the living to ask for prayers.
A popular belief. But some early church figures, like Tertullian and St. John Chrysostom, were pretty skeptical about most apparitions.
Showing that even within the church, not everyone agreed on these things. Calmet throws in this strange story of an excommunicated monk who was repeatedly ejected from his grave until he got posthumous absolution.
Talk about holding a grudge. It raises questions about the power of the church, even after death.
And then there's the debate about whether demons could animate corpses.
That goes against the idea of the soul being separate from the body after death.
Right, a real theological tangle. There's the cautionary tale of Gabinius, who supposedly came back from hell with a false prophecy.
A warning against blindly believing anyone claiming to have been to the other side.
Wise advice. Calmet also mentions those practices with waxen images used to influence people.
And the belief in secret names of cities used in magic rituals.
Rome's hidden name was Valentia, apparently. A mix of magic, folklore, and conspiracy theories all rolled into one.
And those cases of people mistaken for dead waking up later?
The Lady with the Ring, François de Seville. Blurs the line between natural and supernatural, doesn't it?
Makes you think about how much we rely on our understanding of medicine.
Then there's that creepy German belief in the dead chewing flesh in their graves.
Definitely taps into those deep-seated fears about death and decay.
And what about those incorruptible bodies? Saints, weird natural conditions, or something else?
Calmet likely explores all those possibilities.
He also tells stories of ghosts, doing very everyday things, eating, drinking, chatting with the living, causing mischief.
Bringing the supernatural into the mundane world, making it feel closer, maybe even more frightening.
And then you have those accounts of near-death experiences where people claim to have seen heaven or hell.
Stephen, the well-known man, and the young Livonian, for instance. Those types of stories have always fascinated people.
They have. And of course, no discussion of the phantom world would be complete without vampires.
Those creatures of the night rising from the grave. Calmet really grapples with how that could even be possible.
He even details the Moravian vampire case, with the Hungarian stranger and the church steeple.
Illustrating the widespread fear and fascination with vampires. To offer a different perspective, Calmet also includes biblical descriptions of the afterlife, drawing from Isaiah and Ezekiel.
The descent into Sheol, visions experienced by saints like Saint Perpetua, a more official, religiously sanctioned view of the afterlife.
And he emphasizes that spiritual battle Christians believe they were fighting against the devil.
Citing St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, he talks about those early practices of exorcism too.
A way to directly confront demonic influence. Then there are the cases of Martha Brosier and the possessed nuns of Loudun.
Complex and controversial stories that really captivated the public.
Calmet then shifts gears to critique the ancient philosophers' ideas about the soul and the afterlife.
The pagan idea of wandering souls, Plato's views on the destinies of the just and the wicked. He compares these to the Christian concept of heaven, hell, and purgatory.
Showing how Christian beliefs about the afterlife developed in contrast to those earlier ideas.
He even addresses the Jewish belief in spirits returning, using Jesus' own words about spirits not having flesh and bones to counter that.
And there's that story of supposed mass apparitions in Paris.
Witnessed by lots of people, but Calmet seems skeptical about such large-scale events.
Rightly so, perhaps. Remember that story about the princess and her mother?
The one where the mother claimed to have seen the Eternal Father.
Yes, and the princess, sharp as a tack, said, no wonder she didn't recognize him. She's never seen him before.
A bit of humor to lighten the mood.
Definitely needed. Calmet also expresses doubt about making pacts with the devil.
He quotes Horace, saying, "Don't trust magic."
Wise words. And he points out the early Christian belief that magic lost a lot of its power after Christ arrived.
He cites all those early church fathers, St. Ignatius, Tertullian, Origen, the whole gang.
A major shift in thinking. But despite those theological arguments, Calmet admits that superstitions stuck around.
Charms, divining rods, the Kabbalah people clung to them.
Old habits die hard. He also notes the skepticism about more recent visions and revelations from saints.
Not dismissing everything outright, but being discerning. A balanced approach.
Exactly, because even with established doctrine, those folk beliefs have a way of hanging on.
In his wrap-up, Calmet stresses how difficult it is to explain apparitions definitively.
He points to the power of imagination, superstition, and the need for a better understanding of what spirits actually are.
He asks those fundamental questions about their essence, their abilities, how they interact with us.
He even breaks down different types of apparitions, from dreams to shadowy figures, and how hard it is to square those with what we think we know about angels and spirits.
It's a very honest ending, admitting that some things remain beyond our grasp.
It leaves you with that sense of mystery, that human fascination with the unknown. So diving into Calmet's phantom world has shown us just how elaborate and, honestly, how creepy those beliefs about the supernatural were in the 18th century.
It was the time when angels, demons, witches, and spirits were considered real, not just stories.
And our goal hasn't been to say whether they were right or wrong, but to try and understand how they saw the world.
Exactly, to get into their heads, see the world through their eyes.
What stood out to me were things like St. Martin's test for that demon posing as Christ.
Clever guy.
And the ongoing debate about what apparitions really were, and also how some early church figures were skeptical about magic after Christ.
Makes you think about how much our views have changed since then, thanks to science and shifts in culture.
What I'd like you to consider as we leave the phantom world behind is this. What anxieties and needs fueled those historical accounts of the supernatural? And what are our phantom worlds today? the things we believe in, fear, or don't understand.
Because you can bet future generations will be looking back at us trying to make sense of it all.
Just like we've done with Calmet and his world.
Until next time, deep divers, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those lights on.